Thank you all for braving the weather. I'm sure the story we're about to hear has more cataclysmic consequences than a little bit of rain. So, you should feel lucky. This is our ongoing series of conversations about global systemic risk. Basically, we're trying to increase paranoia throughout the community. We've had lots of topics, but we've actually talked very little about the catastrophic risk that I certainly grew up fearing the most, which was thermonuclear war. And for that, we have Benoit Pelopidas. Now, Benoit has many institutional homes. He is normally at the University of Bristol at the International Relations Department, but he also is an affiliate of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. Is that part of Hoover or separate from Hoover?
It's separate.
Okay, good. Separate from Hoover. He received his PhD in politics from Sciences Po in the University of Geneva, and he's been awarded many prizes. And as you will see, his expertise in the scariest of all black boxes is not to be believed. It is to be believed, but it is to be admired. So with that, Benoit?
I would like to start by saying we've been lucky. And that's precisely what we're going to look at this afternoon. We're going to go through two cases which compete for the claim that they are the closest we ever came to nuclear war. One of them is a usual suspect, the so-called 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which is most often portrayed as those 13 days coming from the American literature, but basically depending on whether you're in Cuba or in the Soviet Union, then those 13 days become the October crisis or the Caribbean crisis, and the rest of the world is surprisingly absent from the picture. Actually, what's funny is that in the 1990s, Cuba was promoted from being the place where the crisis took place to an agent in the crisis. So basically, Cuba came to life 3 decades after the crisis, and me being contrarian, my grandma always blames me for that, I thought, where is the rest of the world? So that was actually one of the elements that triggered this research, collaborative research on the global history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But you'll see it's not just about the crisis. This is why we'll touch upon the so-called 1995 Black Brant event, which is a case of near-nuclear use or supposed near-nuclear use after the Cold War. And the questions we're going to look at are, what do we know about those things? What can we know about them? How would we know them better? And how does that allow us to assess global systemic risk or to assess a contribution is not the right word, but the role that nuclear weapons play in the current systems we live in and in basically creating a structure of complex risks. So this is what we're going to go through today. The usual buzzword to talk about cases of near-nuclear use are close calls. So I'll start there. Because ultimately, that should not do that, sorry. Right. So, okay, you shouldn't, so, right. That's funny. So what you see is not what I see. So, very nice. Close, our understanding of close is usually that. So this is Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and when he's interviewed in 2003 by Errol Morris about the Cuban Missile Crisis, he says, this was luck that prevented nuclear war. We came that close. And when he says we came that close, he does this with his fingers. And in a way, if you want to make fun of me for the rest of my life, you can say Benoit can talk about this for 45 minutes. Because this is ultimately what we're going to talk about. This issue of, how do we define close? How close is too close? How close is close enough? Another case that we're not going to talk about is the 1983 war scare, and this is Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who basically said, I'm not a hero, I was just at the right time, at the right place at the right time. But the question remains, how close is close enough? Because precisely in the case of McNamara, he realized risks that were real during the Cuban Missile Crisis 3 decades later during those cycles of oral history interviews. And so then he spent the rest of his life, saying, oh, it was much more dangerous than I thought it was when I was in office. So McNamara's claim is that it was much closer than I thought it was. And when I made decisions as Secretary of Defense, I should have been much more worried than I actually was. The Petrov case is a man who actually decides not to report things he sees on a radar screen because his assumption is, I'm seeing 5 incoming NATO missiles. If NATO was actually attacking us, I would see many more of those missiles. And I was part of a case in which those, Petrov says, I was part of a case in which those radars failed anyway, so it's most likely a radar failure. So he goes against protocol, chooses not to report those cases, and we're endlessly grateful to him for having done that. This is why he got this kind of nickname and a documentary made about him. But what's interesting is the Russian response is, oh, but that's really dangerous because what keeps us safe is the protocol. And this guy went against the protocol. So what they say is it wasn't closed at all because anyway, had he reported, the people up would have made the right decision. So in a way, there are 2 ways of looking at how close is close enough. And what I want to show you is, and this is why this question of how close is close enough is the starting point, but I want to take us away from it because you can actually answer any of those 3 and still end up saying, we're fine, let's not do anything. Because you can say, oh, the Cuban Missile Crisis was really close. We lucked out. It was all terrible. And I will tell you a lot more about that case. But if you're optimistic, you'll say, see, we survived that. It's never going to get any worse. And in the meantime, permissive action links were improved. Nuclear safety was improved. So you can come up with, it was really, really dangerous. Let's not do anything because we've progressed so much since then. Or you can say it wasn't that close. The response of basically the Soviets to the Petrov case in the 80s, therefore let's not do anything. Or it was a fraud, like people claiming that a given case is a close call. This is not authenticated yet. We shouldn't trust those alarmist claims, blah, blah, blah. As a consequence, let's not do anything because we insiders in nuclear weapon states know more about actually how we managed it, and you know what? We survived. Therefore, whether it was close enough doesn't matter. Just trust us. We're really good at managing this thing because the world hasn't blown up yet. So what I'm saying is it's a really interesting and important historical exercise to query about how close is close enough. But if people think that's going to get any either policy impact or that's going to advance our thinking about how to deal with the nuclear weapons problem, either whether we want to be managers or to advocate radical change, that's not going to take us anywhere. We need to move beyond assessing how close is close enough to actually address those questions. And the core target that's going to be the target for the rest of this talk is precisely overconfidence, because I would argue that both experts, policymakers, and the people dealing with nuclear weapons suffer from overconfidence in our existing knowledge. And I'm going to be extremely repetitive about that because this is really the heart of it. Overconfidence means overconfidence in the existence of learning from cases of near-nuclear use, overconfidence in the validity of what we know about them, overconfidence in the unanimity of that learning. So not only do we assume that people learn their lessons, but we assume that they all learned the same lesson. And finally, sufficiency of what we know to continue managing this problem in the present and in the future. This is basically another way of telling you what I just said. So overconfidence is a matter of the validity of knowledge and of basically the type of learning that is supposed to have happened, and that leads to basically an overconfidence in safety and control over nuclear weapon systems. Now, what do we know? Because it's all nice to have me play around with how close is close enough, but what do we actually know about the 2 cases I'm supposed to talk to you about this afternoon? We know a whole lot of things. So this is just background for you to get a sense of what the context leading to those fateful 13 days was in the early 1960s. What I want to tell you at this point is that basically President Kennedy was informed that the Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba, and then he formed a committee called the Executive Committee that is going to be referred to as the EXCOM in my next slide, to advise him on what to do with the situation. So what we do know about the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis is precisely that overconfidence was rampant. Why does that matter? It does matter because the cases I'm going to show you, the cases of overconfidence, are evidence that the explanation that good management was enough to save the day does not work. You cannot say it was good management when people take the right decision out of the wrong information. In that particular case, it's not good management, it's luck. So overconfidence was basically the lack of awareness about limited or false information, overconfidence in weapons safety, and overconfidence in the leaders' control over the weapons on both sides, both on the American and in the Soviet sides. So let's go through that a little bit. The EXCOM members, the advisors to President Kennedy, did not know three things, and actually more, but I'll just pinpoint three, that actually you need to know to manage those crises well. They didn't know that around Cuba, there were 4 Soviet submarines that were carrying 1 nuclear torpedo each. And following Michael Dobbs' 2008 account, we now know that those submarines were hit by practice depth charges because as the quarantine, basically what the Americans did is they created a blockade around Cuba that was called the quarantine because in international law, you know, a blockade is an act of war, so you call it a quarantine. And basically once this quarantine was being implemented, one of the goals was, okay, let's make sure that the submarines actually do surface so that we see, you know, who's in and who's out. To do that, practice depth charges were basically dumped on those submarines. One of them, as a result, lost contact with Moscow. The problem is the procedure suggests that if you lose contact with Moscow, it might mean that there's no Moscow left. And if there is no Moscow left, that might mean that nuclear war has already started. In that case, inflicting as much damage to the enemy as possible is an option. And then the protocol becomes the 3 highest in command in the submarine need to agree to actually launch the nuclear-tipped torpedo. Thankfully, the third one, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, said no. And then nothing actually happened, but we know that the torpedo was loaded in the tube. So we came kind of close enough. What's really interesting is that on the American side, no one knew about that. This is a piece of information that really scared McNamara in the 1990s when he heard about it. He actually didn't believe it at first, and then became one of the most vocal kind of proponents of that episode. Another element that the EXCOM members did not know that we've learned about is that Fidel Castro pushed the Soviets to be more aggressive. But guess why? Because Fidel Castro had experienced the Bay of Pigs, and he had experienced assassination attempts on his own person. So his sense was that the Cuban regime was not going to survive much longer. So if that's the case, he would rather be, you know, in the front of the attack against the capitalists. So there is now, we really have the letters that were exchanged between Castro and Khrushchev, and it's really interesting because Castro is asking for the possibility to use the weapons first, and Khrushchev responds like, Comrade Fidel, that's not going to happen, like, no. And then the third element is the head of the Strategic Air Command, General Thomas Power, had placed American forces on DEFCON 2 during the crisis for the first time in the history of the Cold War. The additional piece of information, he did that in the clear because he thought that would have a really strong deterrent effect on the Soviets. The consequence of that is that the Soviets were aware of it before President Kennedy. So those are really important things that So there is a delay between what you see and what I see. That's not good. Those are really important things that you would need to know in order to make a decision. Problem is, the ExCom members did not know any of that. Then there is a series of cases in which they were overconfident in the safety of the weapons. So Eric Schlosser, in a really interesting and important book, Command and Control, documents cases of weapons armed by mistake in the early 60s, mostly in Europe. My favorite case is in January 1961, a hydrogen bomb, Mark 28, catches fire on an Air Force base. And then there is a little known case documented by Italian historian Leopoldo Nutti, showing that Jupiter missiles in Italy, a few months before the crisis, actually one was hit by a lightning strike and basically caught fire, and a second one basically was unloaded from the truck that was carrying it. That information wasn't really well disseminated because it was originally uncovered by an Italian scholar and originally published in Italian. Now it's getting disseminated slowly. Permissive action links, which are mechanisms to avoid people on the ground from detonating weapons on their own will without following a particular chain of command, were not in place yet. And the authority to launch the weapons could at the time be delegated. We're going to go through that in more details soon. So those are, as you can see, those are modalities of overconfidence in weapons safety. Right. That's a second form of overconfidence, weapons safety. Then the third one would be overconfidence in the leader's control over the weapons. So President Kennedy was always a minority within the executive committee. So you can tell me, yeah, he was a minority, but he was a presidential minority, so that's good enough. Okay. But what's interesting is that most of the ExCom members have changed the role they played in the way they remembered it. Sheldon Stern has a fabulous book called The Cuban Missile Crisis in American History and Memory, in which he traces how, over time, given members of the ExCom portrayed themselves retrospectively in a particular light. And in his book, he shows that at no point the president and the camps opposing using force against Cuba was a majority. At every point in time, President Kennedy was a minority, and even those who were then, proponents of the danger of the Cuban Missile Crisis, like McNamara himself, he changed his mind several times. So the president wasn't in complete control. One of the reasons for that is well documented, is that he also took amphetamines, including during the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at the peak of the crisis, there was an ICBM test launch that wasn't canceled. And to me, that's absolutely fabulous. Because at this point in time, most strategic nuclear forces in the United States are on DEFCON 2 level, so the closest to nuclear war that you can think of. And this ICBM test launch happens. So from the Soviet side, there is no reason why you would think that there is no nuclear warhead on top of that missile. Thankfully, there was no nuclear warhead, and there was no overreaction on the Soviet side. The president learned about it ex post facto. And Scott Sagan has a really good summary of the situation that you can read here. So you've seen different forms of overconfidence which basically go against this idea that it was good management that saved the day. On the Soviet side, you have the same thing. On October 27, 1962, a U-2 plane, that's a U-2, is shot down over Cuba, but the Soviet general in Cuba, or Khrushchev, didn't give the order to shoot this plane down. Same day, another U-2 plane from Alaska strays into Soviet airspace, and nuclear-armed F-102 interceptors scramble to escort the U-2 to safety. The problem is, because again, we're in DEFCON 2, the F-102 interceptors now carry nuclear-tipped missiles, and the pilots can actually decide to use them without having to follow a particular protocol or to request presidential approval. Thankfully, the Soviets turn around, and their American counterparts also turn around. But that's a case in which use of basically military technology and potentially nuclear weapons was outside of the leader's control, either on the Soviet or the American side during the crisis, right? Now, once you've seen all that, what I'm going to argue in the rest of the talk is precisely, instead of talking about arms control or management, we need to take a step back, or even non-proliferation, we need to take a step back and realize that in the 1960s, with the coupling of thermonuclear weapons with intercontinental ballistic missiles, what has started is what I call an age of global nuclear vulnerability, in which it's impossible to protect your population against a nuclear strike, either intended or unintended, and basically every point on the globe is reachable by an ICBM, which cannot be destroyed once it's been launched. So once I've told you that, you could react by saying, look, why do we need to continue studying the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is close to retirement, right? It's turned 53. So why do we need to continue studying the crisis? After all, Elliott Cohen in '86 published a piece saying we should stop studying the Cuban Missile Crisis. I have actually 4 reasons for that, for continuing. It's still referred to in academic and policy circles and activist circles as the closest we came to nuclear war. And it has become iconic. You've probably seen one of the movies about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the ultimate sign that it has become iconic is that the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the few Cold War events that has a superhero movie, right? X-Men First Class. As a consequence of that, everyone has an opinion on it. You know, when you say, I mean, I don't know if that ever happens, but when, you know, over lunch you say Cuban Missile Crisis, everyone has some sort of an opinion or an idea or a response. The reason why that worries me is precisely because that fuels overconfidence. So everyone has an intuition of what the Cuban Missile Crisis is, and so it creates the sense that we've all learned our lessons and we've all learned the same one. And that's the starting point of the book. The book basically says, look, if you talk to people about nuclear risk and you say Cuban Missile Crisis, and you know, the whole group pats themselves on the back and like, yeah. But if one of them thought that the crisis ended up well because Kennedy was tough and the Soviets backed down, which was basically the mainstream interpretation in the first 15 to 20 years after the crisis, and if the other half of the room thought, oh yeah, the crisis ended up well because Kennedy understood that he shouldn't use force, and he used basically secret diplomacy to get the deal with Khrushchev, and so it turned out well because Kennedy was not tough, but was understanding of Khrushchev's security dilemma, which is the mainstream interpretation after that. And those two people talk as if they have the same understanding. It's not going to go anywhere, and more than that, it's going to be dangerous. Precisely, that's what I call overconfidence in the 4 forms. So overconfidence in the existence of learning, the validity of learning, the unanimity of this learning, so the fact that they've all learned the same lesson, and the fact that what we've learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis is sufficient for us to continue living in a nuclear-armed world. So now that I've told you it's worth spending more time studying it, what are the new insights that the edited volume I've been working on is bringing? It's mostly doing 3 things. It's globalizing the crisis, because as I was telling you at the very beginning, it was treated mostly as a bipolar event with Cuba in the middle. So we're really treating the crisis as a global event and documenting its experience worldwide. It's focusing on the risk of escalation to nuclear use or nuclear war and its perception or its understanding at the time. And as a result, it's rethinking the issues of ethics and responsibility in light of what I call global nuclear vulnerability, which basically started in the early 60s. Now, globalizing the crisis, by that I mean we're using new primary sources previously untapped in 13 countries worldwide, and those are the cases that we look at. They're all obvious, so I don't need to read them for you. There is just one surprising element. I guess it's obvious that NZ is New Zealand, but WP is the surprise of the book, right? Because most of the literature, when it talks about the Allies, it just says the Allies. But what we're talking about is the NATO allies. Turns out that the Soviets also had allies. Those guys are called the Warsaw Pact. The only problem is that no one cared about them. So now we have like 2 chapters on the basically experience of the Warsaw Pact during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what do we find? So enough of a tease, we're going to get to the findings. The awareness of nuclear vulnerability varied massively from one place to the next. I'm happy to take questions about country-specific questions. I'm going to give you, a broad brush of the findings. So the awareness of the vulnerability, its nature, the possibility of escalation or of accidental use or of use following a misperception, all of that varied massively from one place to the next. Allies were not consulted. That's not a surprise, but it's always better when you actually document the assumptions you make. Alliance dynamics did not influence great power policies, but the surprise is that it's maybe for the better. Why do I say maybe for the better? Mostly because, as I told you before, Castro was perceived since the 1990s as the bellicose party. And so the proponent of, for example, existential deterrence were making cases like, it would have worked if not for crazy Castro who was destabilizing the whole game. Turned out that, if you realize that Fidel Castro was basically under several assassination attempts, then the craziness becomes a bit reconsidered. But most importantly, he was not the only bellicose party. What we found about Germany, and in particular about Konrad Adenauer, pushing the American administration to be more forceful, was really surprising. And Adenauer did that in spite of the advice of his closest advisors. So I'm going to tell you more about the German case if you want. Another finding is that the belief in neutrality and the possibility of neutrality, even in a situation like a nuclear crisis of that sort, survived in unexpected places. I'm thinking places like the Vatican, I'm thinking places like Sweden, and I'm thinking places like Egypt, which reconsidered the notion of neutrality and argued that non-alignment is the only viable form of neutrality in a world of nuclear vulnerability. Similarly, attempts at negotiations took place in unexpected places. The Brazilians tried to propose their mediation. The Vatican, via Norman Cousins, also did similar things. The Japanese had an idea about proposing something, and then the notion of alliance politics took over. But attempts at negotiations did take place. And another important finding, the population was almost never fully informed of the danger of the crisis. So if you can't wait to see the book, which is going to see the light of day soon, I have a little summary of the findings in an op-ed with the European Leadership Network that you can find online, and a book chapter, or you can come and talk to me. As findings, you also have new questions. And those questions are, what are the consequences of those experiences of the crisis over the following decade? This is what we're going to be investigating in a following volume. Another question, how does the memory of nuclear vulnerability today affect policy? And by nuclear vulnerability, I don't just mean the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I mean Hiroshima, Nagasaki, cases of nuclear testing, close calls like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also including others. And finally, How does the crisis affect the history of the concepts that we use to understand nuclear issues? You know, we came close to the brink, as they call it. Does that change the way people think about nuclear risk? Does that make it more precise? Does that lead them to reintroduce ethical concerns? This is a research program that largely needs to be implemented, and I'm modestly trying to do so. Now, let's move on beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just to show you that this issue of cases of near-nuclear use did not die with the Cold War. On January 25th, 1995, a 4-stage rocket is launched from Andoya in Norway at 7:24 in the morning local time. This is the biggest rocket launched from that site, which, funnily enough, was inaugurated in 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's the largest rocket ever launched from there. The person who is in charge of the launch pad thinks the operation went perfectly fine. But several hours later, he receives a phone call from a panicked journalist saying, actually, this rocket was identified by the Russians as going in their direction. What happened? And so the whole process of turning that event into a close call starts. The next day, President Yeltsin speaks to the press and says that he interpreted that as a possible NATO attack against Russia, and this is the first time he was presented with an open football. This is what he says. So the suitcase that allows him to order nuclear retaliation supposedly was presented to him and open. And so this is what Yeltsin claims. And from that point on, we have very, very few studies of what happened. And we have essentially three competing narratives from then to today. One narrative is what I call the alarmist narrative, which basically follows what Yeltsin said. See how dangerous this is insane, we really need to learn from it, but that can't happen again, it was too dangerous. You have the opposite, the untroubled narrative, which says, look, it all ended up fine, there was no escalation, there was no crisis. Yeltsin, we don't know if what he says is true or not, but that doesn't matter. It all ended up well, let's relax. And you have an in-between narrative that says, actually it's Yeltsin's fabricating this because he needed domestic support in a situation in which he was dealing with Chechnya, and he also needed support from the United States. So you have those three narratives, and they appear in the Swedish press a week after the event. We're 20 years later, they are still there. So after spending so much time studying the Cuban Missile Crisis, one thing you learn is that what changed our understanding of the crisis is oral history conferences. It's when, in the 1990s, people started bringing members of the Kennedy administration and of the Khrushchev administration around the same table to confront their narrative of the events, so that by this confrontation, we came to learn about all the scary moments that I told you about. Problem was with this oral history attempt is that for the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we were 3 decades or 4 decades later, many of the core participants had passed away, and we had to rely on Sergei Khrushchev, so the son of Nikita Khrushchev, and Sergo Mikoyan, the son of Mikoyan, who was basically, I mean, I should tell you more about Mikoyan, but if I get there, it's never going to end. So we relied on the sons of the participants instead of relying on who was there in person. This is one lesson I tried to learn, and so I organized a workshop, an oral history workshop of that particular event with the Norwegian participants, the Russian participants, and the American participants for the 20th anniversary in London in January. And so what I'm going to tell you in what's left of this talk is what we learned from that event. First, we need to learn from this event because it all ended up well, but it all took place in a time of peace, right? When the level of trust was not ideal, but it was not in a time of conflict. So similar event might reoccur in times of crises. And we are now in a time of crisis, right? Overconfidence in technology and obedience can actually create dangerous misperceptions when confronted with unforeseen and unprecedented events. I showed you that with the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So let's not believe that technology, that is early warning systems, and obedience, that is people following the protocol, will be enough for every crisis of that sort to end well forever. So the outcome of the repetition of such an incident in a time of crisis might be much worse than the outcome of this one. As a result, we need to learn from this event. Learning actually did happen. It did happen on the Norwegian side, at least. I could find a change in the routine launch procedure implemented in 1999 in Norway. On the Russian side, an investigation was undertaken by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but its results were never published. But, and that's the scary part, in the US and Russia, overconfidence, which is my preferred target, reigns. What do I mean by that? I mean by that the workshop shows how overconfidence fuels two incompatible narratives that I was telling you about. It fuels the alarmist narrative, and it fuels the untroubled narrative. And it hinders genuine learning. Both narratives, the alarmist and the untroubled, rely on precisely belief in the validity of what we know, once again, the fact that we've learned something already from that event, the fact that this learning was unanimous, we've all learned the same thing, and this learning is sufficient for us to continue living with missile technology and nuclear weapons. Right? Now, how is alarmism fueled by overconfidence? It is because in this workshop we could prove many of the claims that President Yeltsin made and that were the basis for the alarmist narrative. We could prove many of them false. So early on there was a claim that the rocket launched from Andoya was shot down. And no, it wasn't. It landed exactly where it was supposed to land. It wasn't shot down. There was a second claim that the trajectory of the rocket was going towards Russia. And we could confirm that the trajectory was almost vertical and not flying towards Russia. The third element is that the launch notification was claimed to have been either not sent or not received. And it turned out that the launch notification was sent via the Norwegian embassy in Moscow and received by the Russian authorities. There was a claim of an automated response system that was called Dead Hand in the 1990s. Nikolai Sokov went against that early on. And then there was an alarmist claim that the level of alert was the highest level of alert on the Russian side. General Viktor Yesin, who participated in the workshop and was the acting person in charge of the strategic rocket forces in Russia at the time, maintains that the level of alert was only mid-level when he was informed of the launch, and 10 minutes later, when the alert was called off, all the other Russian participants agreed that this level was not changed, was not raised higher than mid-level level of alert. So the supporting pieces for alarmism, a lot of them are demonstrably false, and the workshop served at proving them wrong. You're going to tell me, then let's just relax. The problem is actually we can't, because the untroubled narrative is equally demonstrably either false or irrelevant. Because information does not mean useful information. It's not enough to say a launch notification was actually transmitted and received. And actually, when you look at the information that was passed, it wouldn't have allowed the Russian officers to identify what was coming, because it didn't say the altitude at apogee. So the Russian officer had no way of realizing that what was coming was actually the largest rocket ever launched from the site. It was going to go much higher than anything that they had launched, and that's still just a sounding rocket, just a weather instrument, right? So information was passed, but not the relevant one. What the Russian analysts saw still deserves further investigation. And I'm happy to tell you more about that, precisely because the untroubled or optimistic narrative always says the Russian early warning system worked. And the Russian participants, yes, said the same thing. It did work. But the question is not whether it worked or not. It's like, what could it see? Because on the one hand, you have the Russian participants saying it did work, and we were really serious when we thought that was an attack. And so when you look at the trajectory of the missile, of the rocket, sorry, that's an unfortunate kind of twist. When you look at the trajectory of the rocket, if you see the whole trajectory, you cannot mistake it for a missile. But if you see only the last 3/4 of the trajectory, it's exactly identical to that of a Trident D5. So if actually there is one part of the trajectory that you cannot see, then it makes sense to say we misinterpreted this launch for the launch of a missile. And that becomes really interesting, because if the part that you cannot see is the first quarter of the trajectory, it just means that what you can't see is potentially the North Atlantic, which is where the American submarines are supposed to be based, and which is where, if ever there is one, the massive nuclear attack would come from. So, there is no confirmation of that, but we're facing this contradiction where the Russian side says, we were really seriously scared, the early warning system worked. And you're like, okay, if it worked perfectly and if you could see everything, there was no way you could be scared. If you were scared, it means that you were partially blind, and that's the problem. Tell us that's a problem, and then they go quiet. So this is something that's still worth investigating, but there is a tension there. What I'm getting out of it is it's not good enough to say, yeah, the early warning system worked. So once again, here it's overconfidence in the validity and sufficiency of the existing knowledge. And in an essay that's going to be forthcoming, I document how this overconfidence has been rampant over the last 20 years. What's really scary is that many officials at the highest level on both sides claim that they haven't been briefed about this case. And even when you tell them, okay, I'm organizing a workshop, come and give us your perspective, or come learn more, they express a very, very limited interest in learning more. I'm happy to give you examples of how that works. So now, because I'm a social scientist, the end of this talk will be, okay, now that I've said, all of this is wrong, I need to show you why doing research on it can actually help. So I'm going to propose basically a research program on taking close calls seriously. The problem is that mainstream social science usually have nothing to say about them because they are non-event. Technological solutions will not be enough to basically solve the problem because it can come from misperceptions, as we've seen. Escalation theory and theorizing about the limits of safety are based on a very limited number of case studies and sources. Time alone will not give answers because we know the games of declassification and reclassification, so there will always be competing attempts at giving the full picture. Let's not dream of a time in which full transparency will be there and all we'll have to see is sit and see. That's never going to happen. The retrospective illusion of control, which is one of my targets, is established cross-disciplinarily. Like in cognitive psychology, Danny Kahneman established it, or at least summarized all the ways psychologists had established it before him and then added his own. in sociology, Pierre Bourdieu had a version of that in his work on the biographical illusion. And it's a retrospective illusion of control, which is politically consequential, right? Because if we think we control those weapons, then that means, one, we can manage them endlessly, and the realm of changes we need to think about are at the level of problem solving, right? We don't need any radical or transformative change. How do we do that then? One way of doing it, I think, is to write a global history of close calls based on archives and oral history, knowing that those accounts are temporary. I've tried to do that with colleagues at Chatham House in a published report last year. And once again, we need to keep in mind the provisional nature of this knowledge and the fact that some pieces of information will never be known and that some of them are epistemologically not knowable anyway. So the target remains precisely overconfidence in retrospective illusion, as the idea that learning has existed is unanimous. What we've learned is valid. We need to remember that you can learn wrong lessons and that this learning is sufficient for us to continue living with nuclear weapons. That's basically at the epistemological level, that's where I contributed a chapter that's trying to do that. And it's also a really cool looking book cover. Another thing that we need to do is to bring ethics and democratic theory back into our thinking about nuclear weapons. Thomas Doyle in 2010 has called for a renewal of nuclear ethics, and that's all it was. It was a call for a renewal. It hasn't been implemented yet. And then we need to also understand how precisely ethics and democratic concerns were removed in the first place from our thinking about nuclear weapons. And I would argue that the reduction or the claim of reducibility of luck and uncertainty to risk were the part of that. So that opens a whole set of other questions, like a macro-historical question. Is there an age, such a thing as an age of global nuclear vulnerability? If there is, that's really interesting because that doesn't fit our existing macro narratives of the post-World War II age, right? What we have as narratives in terms of the Cold War, the nuclear age, maybe the golden age of capitalism as grand narratives. So the Cold War obviously is insufficient because it's mostly a bipolar narrative, like Tony Judd wrote the most devastating critique of that narrative. I don't need to build on it. Then the nuclear age is actually a hybrid, which I would argue is built on two narratives in one. The so-called long peace or nuclear peace, and then nuclear proliferation. And therefore, depending on where you stand on proliferation, you end up with so many nuclear ages. You know, some people say 2, Cold War, post-Cold War, others say 3 with the issue of opacity, others say 4, and ultimately it doesn't matter at all. So doing that opens a space for thinking about global danger beyond what I call nuclear exclusivism or nuclear indifference. Because in area studies, for example, you have a lot of people studying conflict or violence that write in a way in which nuclear weapons do not appear. But not only don't they appear, but they write as if we live in a nuclear weapon-free world, which blows my mind. And on the other hand, you have a lot of nuclear scholars that see nuclear weapons as so decisive structures of the global nuclear order that they start there and everything else derives. What I'm trying to say is that if we go back to the notion of nuclear vulnerability, we'll be able to bring ethical questions, questions of political responsibility, which have been kind of pushed aside by a framing in terms of deterrence or non-proliferation. What do I mean when I say bring new ethical and political questions? I'm just going to give you a few. One of them is about the forgotten consensus on the nuclear revolution in the early 60s. This is really an amazing moment. I started by talking about it. In the late 50s, early 60s, there is a consensus across disciplines. So-called realists in international politics like Hans Morgenthau or John Hertz completely change their mind and say, okay, sovereignty, which is what we've based our career so far, is done. Because with ICBMs coupled with thermonuclear weapons, states cannot protect their population any longer. So we need to think anew about this age. At the same time, in philosophy, Gunther Anders, Hannah Arendt, and others have the same sense that nuclear vulnerability forces a new form of thinking. And even on the Marxist side, C.B. Macpherson makes a point of that sort. I need to tell you one more sentence just for you to see how important that is. The sentence on nuclear vulnerability in Macpherson's work is at the end of his book on John Locke, right? So that doesn't have anything to do with John Locke. It's about possessive individualism, but Macpherson concludes about how this whole, Marxist theory of historical development needs to take that into account. That shows you how deep this consensus is. This consensus basically suggests that defense is impossible, so thinking has to be in terms of deterrence. Distance can no longer protect you because those missiles will reach you wherever you are. Alliances have become irrelevant. So one of the questions is, okay, there was this consensus among scholars and among strategists. Does that have any traction on the way the Cuban Missile Crisis is handled? And that's one of the things we look at in the book. Another question is, what does thermonuclear vulnerability do to the possibility of democratic government? Obviously, it decreases decision times for leaders who cannot consult their population or even guarantee the survival of their population. And I already told you that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, democracies did not score much higher in terms of communicating the threat with to their citizens. By doing that, you're actually also reconsidering core concepts like responsibility, the possibility of neutrality and mediation, and the meaning of security architectures like the UN Security Council. And so I'm reaching the conclusion. I hope I managed to convince you that a renewed engagement with nuclear close calls is needed, that asking how close is only the beginning of the research we need to be doing, and that epistemic and existential vulnerability are fruitful starting points to engage with systemic dangers, that we should focus on pathways to disasters instead of looking at hypothetical patterns. And finally, let's keep in mind that learning can also be learning the wrong lessons. Some of those lessons are dangerous, and we shouldn't assume that we've all learned the same. So to tell you that in a graphic way, this is where we are, ultimately, and this is where I'm proposing to take us. Thank you.
Oh, so at the Oral History Conference you had in January of, this year?
Sorry.
So you invited participants from the Brant episode, right?
Yeah.
Did they have significant differences among themselves about when they were discussing what happened? But so it wasn't, I mean, I realize you didn't have time to go into that. So I'm just wondering, did they think that, I mean, apart from your analysis, did they think when they came to the end of the conference that there were a lot of things they didn't know? Or had they revised their views, or?
Right, that's a great question. There is I mean, I could speak for 3 days about that. But the two interesting things is that they started with pretty serious differences, and then they came to agreement on many issues, and all of them realized that there were important pieces of the puzzle that they were not aware of. So you see, for example, General Yassin really insisted on the fact that the early warning system worked, and that the level of alert hadn't been as high as was previously claimed. But then he also, ended up agreeing with the problem potentially caused by limitations of early warning systems and with other pathways to disaster. So what was interesting is that we had a dynamic which was similar to the one in the Cuban Missile Crisis conferences, where there are contradictions. From those contradictions, what emerges is overconfidence on both sides, and then people realizing that we as a group know much less than we thought we knew before. So that actually created a whole set of research questions, and so the essay out of that is going to come out early next year. But the reason why I'm telling you all that is because the gap between January and the essay coming out next year is precisely that out of the workshop we had evidence, of pieces of the alarmist claim being wrong. We found that precisely the notification letter didn't have the appropriate information in it, but we also found whole new things to be investigated. So it took me basically 8 months to investigate all of those, to bring whatever I found back to the participants to reach provisional conclusions that are going to be published. Al?
Yeah, I had a similar question. So, I mean, the oral history with the Cuban Missile Crisis scared everybody. I mean, because besides the things you mentioned, Benoit, there are other things that, the Russians had tactical nuclear weapons aimed at Guantanamo, and there were several things. Whereas the oral history with the 1995 Norwegian tests didn't, I don't think. I mean, it raised questions maybe, but it didn't make people think, oh God, it was reassuring rather than more frightening. And I think isn't that true? I mean, the difference between the two oral histories are pretty striking.
No, but yes. Actually, that's extremely helpful, because actually I thought that was going to come across. But that's the point. That's why I chose those two. Because the oral history of the Cuban Missile Crisis scared people, and the Black Brant, the response was, see, it's reassuring after all. But what I wanted to show is precisely on both ends, you have overconfidence and you have an underestimation of what could have gone wrong. Because similarly, what we found after the Black Brant event is that, at the highest level of Stratcom or even in the Pentagon, people were not that concerned about learning about what happened on that day, knowing that this all happened in peacetime. And if that happens, in a crisis situation, a lot of the mechanisms that ended up going on well might just go wrong. I mean, this is all listed. But the idea was precisely to have a contrast between an attempt of doing oral history that actually brings a whole set of scary elements when people thought it was okay, and an oral history where you still have the two competing narratives. And so depending on who you talk to, people have a memory of Black Brant as really a non-event, like don't bother. I mean, some people even told me that there was no point in doing that. And on the other hand, you have people who are still on the Yeltsin line, saying it's still the scariest event in the post-Cold War. I mean, the Union of Concerned Scientists still basically published a thing in April this year, which has all the elements of the alarmist narrative that that we proved false. Yeah.
So, two questions on Black Brant. One, you said the alert level was not as high as people thought. Should I translate that to mean that the football was not opened, or what's the current thinking on that? And the second question is, was there any discussion about whether Yeltsin thought that maybe he didn't need to respond because the Moscow missile defense system would, take care of this, and so he had more time at least to respond? Was there any discussion of that?
So given the level of alert that the Russian participants agreed to, there is no way that the football was open. There is even no way that the football was presented to the president. So the result of our conference is that Yeltsin made it up. Right. Now there are several versions of how did he make it up, and when did he make it up, for what purpose did he make it up. Now he probably was informed at some point, but that part wasn't valid. Was there another part in your question?
Missile defense thing. Was there any discussion that Yeltsin might have thought his missile defense system would save the day, and so he didn't have to?
Oh, so you mean the theater missile defense around Moscow, right? That didn't come up at all in the conversations. So I don't have anything meaningful to bring to the conversation about that.
In the movie Dr. Strangelove, even though it was a comedy, do you see any seeds of truth in a possible outcome like that?
So it's funny, there are many jokes, and I'm going to refrain from doing another Strangelove joke, but that basically says that's the best documentary on the nuclear age. I mean, Strangelove is an interesting take on the possibility of unauthorized nuclear war. What's interesting is Tom Schelling just gave an interview for the anniversary of the Kennedy School, in which he talks about Strangelove and how he was concerned. Thomas Schelling, so Nobel laureate, eminent nuclear strategist. But what that tells you is that there is a whole rationalist tradition that really has difficulty thinking about all-out nuclear war in practice. Because all of the Schelling's work in theory and his legacy is all about, we're assuming that's a possibility, and then we're creating ways to avoid it. But in his interview, and in a set of research that I'm happy to talk about, you can see that it's always a virtual possibility in his mind. It's a possibility that actually never materializes. He speaks about the end of Dr. Strangelove for 5 minutes, and that's fabulous, because he keeps saying, we don't really understand the end of Dr. Strangelove. And you see in the book, because it's adopted from a book called Red Alert, it's much better. Guess why it's much better? Because in the book, you have 5 planes, one crashes in the forest. Three are shot down and 1 returns. So in the book, it's much better because it fits the model. So actually, Strangelove is also interesting at showing you how precisely this overconfidence in the controllability of nuclear weapons can lead you to create models in which accidental use is possible as an assumption, but then you create a theory that washes it away or delays it endlessly. And that's what Schelling has.
So what does Schelling think Boone Pickens is doing on the way down? Trying to disarm the bomb? I mean, the end of Strangelove is not exactly ambiguous.
No, but that's the thing. No, you need to watch that. He's like, no, we don't understand what's happening. And to me, what that says is this is a theory that's only interested in the process. It's about the decision-making process. What bothers Schelling is that in Dr. Strangelove, you don't know how the nuclear war starts. So that's annoying, because it's all about discovering the process. But he's telling you, we don't really understand what happened. And to me, that's unbelievable. Mark.
But hang on, I mean, there is some literature, I'm thinking rather Jervis, that says that human irrationality and fear and risk aversion can be manipulated, and it can be used to, inspire restraint in the adversary, right? And yes, that does involve upping the ante, that does involve raising the stakes, that does involve taking on risk. And yes, as decision makers, you have to reconcile that policy, that risky policy, with whether this will blow up in your face, literally. And I mean, this is a source of, this overconfidence that you describe, or what people would call overconfidence. I guess maybe my question is, many countries, democracies, maybe also not democracies, have states, they have people who, have a stake in survival of the state. And, when you take on this risk as a country, you have to, kind of sell it to policymakers, to the population. And it's not palatable if you're saying we're going to go all in, we're going to risk a nuclear war to, for a chance that we might gain a little bit on our adversary. I'm wondering, do political systems have an effect on how these policies are sold, and how much overconfidence is?
So I have a good news and a bad news for you, Mark. Which one do you want first? Okay, so the bad news is after this question, I'm going to send you my Schelling essay tomorrow, sorry. The good news is I think I kind of have an answer. I don't disagree with the fact that you can play with the other side's expectation, that you can be risk taker, right? I don't deny that. I'm not saying that strategy always fails, not at all. I'm saying two things. I'm saying one, because if it doesn't work, the consequences are going to be terrible in that no one is actually aware of that. In a democracy, that's a massively important problem of political responsibility and ethics. And dear Schelling doesn't deal with it in that way because for him, ethics are basically subjective preferences. So that's my first problem. And the second problem is that actually what he does is that he makes the mistakes that Machiavelli told us we should never make. In The Prince, Machiavelli has this thing about fortuna, so he talks about luck, and he says, fortuna cannot be domesticated. Maybe we can manipulate half of it, but there is always half of it that falls upon us, and that it's like fate, and that we can't pretend to grab it by, Anyway. What Schelling does is that he tells you and theorizes about the bit that can be manipulated and pretend that's the whole story. And you can't do that. That's an epistemological fallacy. So those would be my answers to you. But I'm more than happy to kind of continue on that. I'm not saying that strategy never works, not at all. I'm saying obfuscating it as a way of endlessly delaying the moment when it's going to fail is politically consequential and ethically problematical. Frank?
I mean, this is a very important project. Are you continuing it?
Yes.
And do you have the resources to?
So if I was smart, I would say no. So the Cuban Missile Crisis side. So we are a team of 14 researchers, and all of them are on board for the second part on the consequences and the learning in the short term. What we're interested in, by the way, is how this learning is stabilized. So we're looking at textbooks. How do people, how in different countries, how is this knowledge transferred and transmitted to the next generation of citizens? Do people learn that Kennedy was tough and that was great, or do people learn that Kennedy was not tough and that was great? So I have a grant to do part of it, and I'm still looking for resources to continue on Black Brant and the close calls. For now, what is there is this essay and the transcript of the workshop. And in terms of questions of ethics, questions of how this age of global nuclear vulnerability went into being, this is actually a monograph that I'm planning on writing while I'm here. Yes, we should talk more about what comes next. Oh yeah, sorry, I probably ignored this side. Please.
If we could fast forward to 2015.
So you know what? I'll be there so that I can see everyone. Okay.
If we could fast forward to 2015, I'm just thinking about probably the two most combustible areas in the world, North Korea and the Middle East, in particular Iran. I just wondered how the lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Norwegian incident here with Russia have helped the United States in averting a showdown with North Korea and also dealing with the nuclear crisis with Iran. Have we learned the lessons in terms of deterrence?
Okay. So I guess my answer is not going to be very surprising. From the Black Brant event, the lessons learned were so limited and the interest of people in learning them was so low that I would be surprised if any lesson was actually learned. And you know, on the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's really interesting. People, I've given these talks in other places, and people responded by saying, no, but you see, there was consistency. People have always claimed that the determination of President Kennedy was what caused the outcome of the crisis. Yes, except for the fact that in the first 15 years, it was the determination of Kennedy to be tough, and in the next 20 years, it was the determination of Kennedy not to go with the tough guys. So this consistency is not consistency. So I would really not put the fate of the Earth on the idea that, you know, the strategists in command have learned the right lessons and they're wise men. They mean well, absolutely, but they always think they know more than they actually do, and they always think that they control way more than they actually do. And that's what basically scares me.
Just on this knowing more, I mean, this line that you have of overconfidence in the validity and sufficiency of existing knowledge applies to just about every single system that we've talked about for the last 3 years, whether it's financial, epidemiological. So, my question is, if we take bounded rationality, Herbert Simon bounded rationality, as permanent, will there ever be sufficient and valid information? Or is this something you don't open because you're never going to be able, so you don't get a Doberman, no matter how well trained, because one point or another, the Doberman's going to turn on you. And you just don't trust the training. And so instead of gathering knowledge, what we should be doing is, this is unknowable, and the odds may be 1 in a million, but that's pretty bad with Armageddon. And we should just get rid of everything.
So,
which is not going to be very popular in certain circles.
No. But so, that's great, because that takes me to this thing. So, the point precisely is to say there is a knowable. And most of the conversation about nuclear weapons related future is a conversation engaging people who really either talk expertly from the policy community, the scientific community, or whatever community, but there is this idea that I know what I'm talking about, right? Like it's a matter of knowledge that this can be decided by competent and reasonable people. What I want to show you is precisely, there are things that we can know and we should learn, but there are mostly things about the limits of the intended consequences of what we do. Most of what we have to learn is that any social action, which is a basic of social sciences, right? Any social action has unintended consequences. And in a world with nuclear weapons, those unintended consequences are pretty severe. Once you know that they exist and you cannot be accountable for all of them, then that opens the door precisely for a necessary engagement with ethics and responsibility, because then it's precisely a bet on the future. It's a bet. Let me give you an example. Think about three types of future events. One of them is a failure of nuclear deterrence with catastrophic consequences. That's one. Second event, large-scale disaster, same scale, of a non-nuclear nature, like climate change kills us all, right? Third element, technological revolution that dramatically changes the consequences of nuclear use. Like we managed to create mini nukes and to go really low under, what Seth would call the nuclear winter threshold. So those three events, we don't know and cannot know which one of the three will come first, right? But if you bet that climate change will kill us all before a catastrophic failure of deterrence, it becomes much easier to say we don't need to care about nuclear weapons related problems. You still can care about them for moral reasons, legal reasons, and a few others. But what I'm saying is where we end up policy-wise depends massively on bets of that nature, on the consequences of a nuclear disaster and on the order of future possible disasters. And those bets are ethically informed and they are not a matter of knowledge. And they are massively consequential, but they need to be part of the conversation. Yes?
Do you think the hydrogen bomb changed the nuclear game? And how would you contrast Teller's influence to Oppenheimer's?
Oh, right. Of course, the thermonuclear bomb changed the nuclear. I don't call it. The analogy with games really makes me extremely uncomfortable. And then actually, that's the thing also, by the way. In the 60s, it made almost everyone tremendously uncomfortable. But then, basically, the literature on ethics was disciplined away from nuclear weapons until the late 70s. And people like Anatole Rappaport were forgotten, and Philip Green's deadly logic was forgotten too. So everyone was, talking about chicken and anyway. So it's not a game. This being said, it did change, but it did change mostly because those thermonuclear weapons were coupled with ICBMs. So to me, it's not just the thermonuclear, it's not just the device and the destructive power, it's the combination with a particular delivery vehicle that actually changes the speed, changes the possibility to intercept, and then changes the possibility to basically defend against it. Yes, you looked outraged. What did I say?
With respect to nuclear weapons and climate change,
Yeah.
we can do more than one thing at a time. Climate change is a problem, we should work on that, but that doesn't mean we should stop working on nuclear weapons, and vice versa if nuclear weapons ends up being the bigger risk or so on. If we know with certainty that there's going to be a climate change catastrophe first and that's going to kill us all, then that needs our attention. But with all of these things, we don't know with certainty what would happen, and so I would resist the idea that we should kind of put all our eggs in one basket.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the priorities are defined by bets on the future in terms of the consequences of a nuclear disaster and the order of those three types of events. I'm not saying we should do only one at the same time. I'm saying the levels of priority are defined by those bets, and those bets are not just a matter of knowledge. They're a matter of precisely an ethically and politically informed judgment on the future we want, we're ready to fight for, and we expect. And that's not, those issues are tremendously consequential and are not solvable by experts, however well-intentioned they are. This is why you need to bring that back into a democratic arena.
Benoit, I have just a quick question.
Yes.
To sort of following on Miguel's question.
I feel I'm always turning my back on someone.
No, that's fine. So Miguel in one of his slide presentations has this great quote from Mark Twain when you're talking about overconfidence, where he says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So this theme that you're talking about, as Miguel said, we're starting to hear it over and over again. So my question is, digging a little bit deeper, why do we tolerate and encourage overconfidence? And I want to give you three suggestions and get your three things that I just thought of. as you were
So
talking.
why do we tolerate it?
And encourage it, we
Okay.
reward it. Okay, so
Uh-huh.
I'm thinking, let me take it out of this context and put it in the context of Wall Street. If you have someone who's a leader of an investment bank or a hedge fund, and they come in and they say, well, we're not really sure what the right strategy should be, that person's gonna get fired, and they're gonna bring in someone who is absolutely certain housing prices will never go down, right? And so that person is rewarded, and until something bad happens. Same thing with politicians. Politicians are not rewarded for standing on the stump and discussing all of the areas of uncertainty, right? But they're very harshly punished when they make predictions or pronouncements with confidence that turn out to be incorrect, whether about the economy or war or any of that stuff. So the three things I thought of is maybe in the face of uncertainty, confidence is the opposite of fear, right? So we look to some sort of assurance. Secondly, maybe it's a simplifying heuristic just to reduce our cognitive dissonance of all the possibilities. And third, which is a little more cynical, is that it's often conflated for competence and leadership, right? So if our goal, or your goal in looking at overconfidence is to expose it, how do we talk about it in a way that makes people stand up and listen?
Right. So I have an answer that Seth will like, which is, I mean, the three avenues are valid. We don't have to put all our eggs in the same basket, really. Like the idea that confidence is a way to handle fear, absolutely. And, to go back to my philosophers, when Gunther Anders publishes his thesis on the nuclear age, he says, we have a duty to fear, and his whole point is precisely that no, the managerialists are going to tell you that this is a problem, look here, don't look around. So, of course, it's a way of handling fear, because the fear can ultimately paralyze you and can be a problem. You need to create a virtuous fear somehow. Not terror that immobilizes you, but basically there is a whole saying in Aristotelian philosophy, you have this idea that any virtue is a balance between two extremes. And so Aristotle has this idea that being brave is not being afraid, because the one who's not afraid is a fool. Being brave is being afraid, but act on top of this fear and use this fear as a way of getting advice. So, that's for the fear element. Then, as you said, in organizations, the one who's bringing doubts is unpopular, right? And I want to emphasize that, because I think one way of acting is precisely look at, and this is why earlier I was talking about democracy in general, but like here I'm going to use a more precise concept, the issue of accountability. The whole, financial crisis thing is about, accountability and how the causes of the crisis become those we rely on to fix it and basically don't lose their authority. So what needs to be looked at is how a set of experts lock in a position so that they become too authoritative to fail, right? Even when their policies are problematical or creating a disaster, they're still in charge, of their advice is still considered as valuable. So to me, the organizational element leads us to think about if we want to expose overconfidence and fight against it, let's look at the institutional structures that make experts unaccountable and allow them to create a niche in which they are the only ones in charge of a sacred piece of knowledge that's indisputable whatever happens, even if actually their predictions have effects. I should stop there.
We should probably stop there. And
Okay.
Trust experts is always a very good motto for a university.
Thank you.